next template that we're going to be looking at is the Methodologies template. And we're going to be looking at this template from the perspective of the methodologies of evaluating a gifted education program, which of course connects directly to that assignment that you have for the GFED 690 course in developing a full evaluation of a gifted ed program either in your district or in a neighboring district. And so if we were to use the multiple menu model template in order to evaluate the methodologies of that aspect of the field, one of the things that we would look at is the process of conducting a program evaluation. In designing a program evaluation, there are 9 basic steps that we'll be looking at. And you're going to recognize these steps because these are the same 9 steps that are laid out in the Van Tassel basket text. That text being designing and evaluating for gifted education improvement. And so the 9 steps we're going to look at are pulled from that textbook. And by the way, that's what you want to do in order to identify the methodologies that will be useful for your particular unit plan. You want to go to college level textbooks, how-to books, or go directly to the source, an expert in the field, that can tell you what steps that they utilize in doing their job. Again, remember, the goal here is to be as authentic as possible to the original discipline. So, for program evaluation, there are 9 steps. The first, research the program's background, its history, read through some of the original materials, their goals, and any documents that they've produced, as well as doing some interviews of the staff that you're going to be working with. And from that initial background information, you will then determine the evaluation's purpose, as well as the research questions that you'll be specifically looking for over the course of that evaluation. Once you have that, your second step is to actually design your evaluation process, to lay out a full-scale plan. How long are you going to spend doing this evaluation? What tools are you going to work with? Who's going to be involved in this evaluation process? What members do you need to bring in as far as part of your team? And who are you going to be interacting with there at the gifted education site? Thirdly, you then need to actually tailor your instrumentation. You design your surveys. You plan out your focus groups and the questions that you'll ask. Begin to identify materials that you can use for doing observations in that gifted education program specifically. So, are there some data sheets that you can work with? Will you utilize a variety of forms that have already been designed by outside individuals that can be available for purchase or for simple download, or are you going to design your own observation forms? The next step is to actually implement the evaluation and collect your data. That sounds obvious, but this is going to be where you spend the bulk of your time. And so you're going to begin your implementation. And once you've done that, you move on to the next step, which is actually analyzing and triangulating the data. And by analyzing, you're going to use a variety of resources. You may pull that data into an Excel spreadsheet and begin to do summaries of the data, be able to sort it in different ways to look for patterns. And you're also going to need to do some triangulation. Of course, it's an important concept in the field of evaluation that you want to make sure that you're not trusting data from just one angle, that you want to be able to back that information up with other research tools in order to prove the reliability and validity. And I do want to point out that as I'm discussing this, those would be some of the core concepts that would be part of teaching you how to do program evaluation. The idea of reliability, validity, triangulation. And they build into a principle of gifted program evaluation, and that principle is that data needs to be verified, that it needs to be shown to be valid, that it needs to be shown to be reliable. Reliability meaning that it's going to, if you do the test several more times, that each time you did that test within a reasonable accuracy, the results would be the same. And this idea of triangulation is that if you were to give someone a paper-based survey, and then you're going to do a focus group, and then you're going to do some observations of the program in action, that the data should be identical, or at least drawing to reasonably similar conclusions, no matter how you gathered that data. If you're getting different information on a survey than you're getting from your observation, then you need to do additional research to find out why you're getting those discrepancies. And so this section of the methods of doing a program evaluation is extremely important. Taking the time to do triangulation to make sure that the data is showing up as valid is a core principle based on the concept of validity. It's a core principle of doing effective educational research. The next step then is to actually answer the evaluation questions. Again, that loops back to the beginning of the process in which you laid out your hypotheses, you laid out your key questions for the evaluation. Now you're going to answer those questions and to be able to make an assertion as to whether the information was truly accurate, the hypothesis was accurate or not accurate, to be able to give the institution that you're evaluating the information they needed by answering the questions that you agreed to research for them. Your next step is to actually frame or write the program recommendations. So based on all of the research, having analyzed it and triangulated it, having answered the initial research questions, then what recommendations would you make to that program for them to improve what they're doing? To be able to improve their process, to be able to improve their documentation, to be able to improve their educational methods. So you're going to begin to frame some of those recommendations. And you're going to frame them back in the quiet of your own office. But then you're also going to need to communicate those results, which is our next step. Communicate those results to the key stakeholders, and perhaps as you're communicating that to them, you're going to actually continue to revise and to evaluate the information and the answers that you come up with. Because sometimes what we find out is that in communicating our final results, we're able to then have further dialogue and further focus groups with those key stakeholders, which allows us to then refine our data even further. Finally, after you've communicated the results of the program, your final step would be to develop an action plan. And that action plan would be what the program needs to do to actually instill those recommendations, to actually implement them. And so not only are you going to frame recommendations for them, you're going to give them the opportunity to sit down with you and to establish timelines, to establish those folks that are going to be responsible for each area of improvement, and ways of evaluating whether they're making those improvements in a timely fashion. So this part is vital, because simply telling them what they need to do to change isn't enough. They need some assistance, usually in most programs, in actually establishing an action plan. The methods that they're going to take to implement your recommendations, specific time frames, specific stakeholders will be responsible for each step of that implementation. So that if you were to do an evaluation 5 years later of the program, hopefully they've made all of the improvements that were recommended. Otherwise, unfortunately, sometimes these sorts of reports get filed away and nothing happens, and we want to avoid that by having a very clear action plan. So this would be one method that's used by evaluators in gifted education programs. This is one process that they go through on a regular basis as a practicing professional. Now, when you're developing your methodologies chart, it's not just a single method or a single process that you're attempting to teach to your students, but there are often 3 or more possible methodologies that you want to instill in your students. So, in the case of gifted evaluation, we've looked at how to develop a full gifted evaluation plan if you were going to go into a gifted ed program and conduct a long-term study. But another piece of that is simply designing good evaluation instruments. And those could be as part of a long-term study, or they could be an evaluation instrument that a teacher might use in his or her classroom for more action-based research. So there's some key steps that are important for developing that sort of short-term evaluation, or taking that same instrument and designing it for a longitudinal study. So those steps include 1, developing a clear hypothesis. What do you think is happening in your classroom? Why do you think it's happening? And setting out that hypothesis in a very clear and simple way. 2nd, design an experiment that would let you test that hypothesis. Design a way to gather the data that you need, whether it's through observation or some sort of research experiment, and to be able to lay that out. 3rd, establishing controls. It's important when you're doing any kind of research to have a clear control, whether that's by having a core group that's getting the treatment and a second group that is a control that is not going to have any change over the course, whether it's establishing a baseline for the student that you're observing before you instill a treatment, and then once that treatment is completed, you remove it and then establish a baseline again and see if you've had a clear change in the student's behavior. But having some sort of control so that at the end of the study you can definitively say that certain effects had very definitive causes without having to hedge or having 3 to 5 possible causes, in which case you don't have any way of knowing how to move forward from that point. So establishing controls is important. The next step is working with appropriate sample sizes. So if you have a population of 120 students, how many students do you need to survey? How many students do you need to provide treatments to in order to be able to have an appropriate sample size that would then be able to be scaled up to accurately represent the full population? So dealing with samples is an important part of establishing an evaluation. Testing for reliability and validity. Are you able to say that if you did the test again a month later or a year later or with other students that you get the same results? So how do you know that the test or the research experiment that you did is actually reliable and valid? And so that's an important part of learning how to create evaluation and research instruments. And the final step is actually gaining approval through an institutional review board and abiding by the ethics within that particular field. Those are all core processes in developing evaluation and research instruments. So that again is a second type of method. And so you see in the chart that I've laid out two methodologies for the field. One, the processes of developing a full program evaluation, and second, at a more simpler level, how do you design the evaluation instruments that could be part of that larger program evaluation, or might be a standalone research model that might be used to work with in a single teacher's classroom. So this is what we mean by the methodologies template, identifying the methodologies of a particular field. And in this case, the field is gifted education, and the two methodologies that I gave you are methodologies that you'll be implementing within this course itself. Hopefully that helps clear up the methodologies template, and you're able to now implement that effectively in your own research.